What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're having a look at the very intense game Hans Niemann versus Magnus Carlsen from the 2024 World Blitz Championships. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Hans Niemann opens 1e4 best by test as he almost always does, and here Magnus goes 1e5. Then we have knight f3, knight c6, and of course Hans Niemann is a big aficionado of the bishop c4 Italian opening, and that is what he goes for in this game. So bishop c4, black goes bishop c5, and from here both sides follow the absolute main line of the Gucci piano. We're going to skip forward here a little bit. So d3, knight f6, castles, castles, h3, h6, c3, d6, rook e1, and now black finally, he really has to decide, do you want to go a6, a5, or bishop b6? In the game, a6 was chosen, giving his bishop some space on a7 to retreat to. Continuing now, Hans Niemann, he doesn't really go for the main line in this Italian opening against a6. The main line, of course, includes going b4 and a4, gaining space on the queen side, but instead, Hans Niemann, he goes knight d2, intending a very fast knight f1, and he is sort of a specialist in this line as white. It's very interesting. Most white players do opt for the b4, a4 plan in this position, but Hans Niemann sticking to his guns, going for the knight f1, knight g3 idea here. All right, black continues, rook e8, setting up bishop e6 ideas, challenging the white bishop on c4. White goes knight f1. Black goes bishop a7. Now white continues, knight g3 once again, and finally we do have that move, bishop e6. Now we have bishop takes and rook takes, and now the opening phase of the game is mostly over. We have a mostly equal position. However, white may have a tiny bit of an advantage here, as of course he does have the option of going for a fast d4 break in the center, gaining a little bit of space and threatening the move d5, forking both the knight and the rook. Of course, beyond that, white is in no rush. He is in no obligation to go d4. He can go, say, for example, queen b3, queen c2, b4 or a4, bishop b3, bishop d2, c4, and on and on and on. White has a lot of different options in this position, but sure enough, in the game, Hans Niemann is in a very aggressive move. He does go d4, immediately breaking in the center and gaining space. And what is black going to do about it? Well, here, turns out the strongest move for black is going to be d5, immediately blowing open the center, giving us that famous pawn square in the middle of the board where everything is attacking literally everything. Now, instead of that, in the game, Magnus Carlsen, rook to e8 is the move. A very typical Magnus Carlsen move, avoiding the immediate confrontation in the center, instead playing a slightly dubious move, which does give white a little bit of an advantage, but maintaining the tension where he can potentially outplay his opponent a little bit easier. All right, Hans Niemann, he continues, bishop b3, bolstering that pawn on d4. Now black takes on d4, and very importantly here, in this position, white must recapture with the bishop. Bishop takes d4 is the right move. If you don't do that, let's say you go c takes d4. The problem with that move is with the bishop on e3, the pawn on e4 is undefended, or is not defended enough. Black's attacking it twice with the knight and the rook, and it's only being defended once by that knight on g3. Therefore, black can swoop in and immediately take that pawn. So instead of that here in this position, bishop takes d4 was chosen. Now Magnus takes back with the knight, knight takes d4, and c takes d4. And now here we have a very healthy imbalance in this position. White, of course, having those two central pawns versus the pawn majority on the queen side of black. However, in return, black does have the extra bishop versus the two knights of white, and that extra bishop does mean his minor pieces do have a little bit more scope throughout this middle game, and that extra bishop does give black at least a little bit of compensation for his slightly reduced central control in this position. All right, black continues, c6, a very solid move, potentially intending d5, potentially intending bishop b6, then c7, and so on. Black has a lot of ideas here. All right, white continues, queen b3, pressuring the weak pawn on b7. What is black going to do about it to defend that pawn on b7? Well, he has a few different options. You can go queen b6 or c7. Beyond that, rook b8 is possible, and queen d7. In the game, rook b8 chosen, defending with the rook. Now we have rook a d1, this being one of the ideas of queen b3 in the first place. You develop the queen, clear the back rank for the rook, and then go rook a d1, centralizing all of your pieces. All right, black continues, rook e6, centralizing his rook. Now Hans Niemann, again, he has a wide variety of ways to continue. The strongest, most aggressive option may be e5. The point being, if black takes on e5, you take back with the pawn, and you have the double attack on both the knight on f6 and the queen on the d8 square. However, beyond that, you can go say rook e2, queen d3, or queen c2 as chosen in the game. Now here, Magnus, he makes a little bit of a mistake. I think he was concerned about the idea of knight f5 from white, and with that in mind, he does go g6 here, but this move does considerably weaken the king side, especially those dark squares on f6 and h6. Instead of that, there were a million other options, the main idea being getting your queen off the back rank to the 7th rank and then developing your rook on b8. Instead, g6 chosen in the game, and here Hans, his spidey senses are tingling. He drops back queen c1, targeting the weak pawn on h6 immediately. Now we have king g7, but then queen to f4, showing the other idea of queen c1 on the prior move. The queen swoops in to the very strong, very well centralized f4 square, and again, white is threatening ideas like e5, blowing open the center, gaining space, and white overall has a very pleasant edge in this position. All right, how is black going to continue? He goes queen to e7, getting his queen off the back rank. Instead of that queen to f8, may have been a little bit more precise, but instead queen e7 chosen in the game, pressuring the e-file with the queen and the rook. Now here, Hans Niemann, the strongest move is e5, but instead he plays a much trickier move, a move I like quite a bit. He goes knight to h4. Now, what is the idea behind this move? It's very, very simple. If black wastes a move, let's say he goes rook to e8, a fatal mistake, then Hans Niemann, he would jump in with the knight to the f5 square. The point being, if you take knight number 1, knight number 2 jumps in and it forks the king and the queen on g7 and e7. That would immediately be fatal. So you can't do that. Instead, king to h7 chosen in the game, stepping out of the way of a knight f5 check idea, as then the king would not be under check. All right, now knight f3 chosen, retreating the knight. Now black, he has the option of going king g7, inviting a draw by repetition after knight h4, king h7, knight f3, king g7, and so on. Instead, rook e8 chosen in the game, Magnus Carlsen getting the Alekhine's battery of the rook, the queen, and the queen on the e-file. What will Hans Niemann do about it? Well, here, very interestingly, as soon as black gets the Alekhine's battery, named after Alexander Alekhine, one of the greatest chess players of all time, he goes e5 in response, immediately attacking in the center of the board, but this was not the time to go e5. Black is just too strong on the e-file right here, right now. All right, knight d5 chosen, bringing the knight out to the weakened d5 square and pressuring that queen on f4 immediately. Where is the queen going to go? Well, d2 may in fact be the best square for the queen, but instead, queen g4 chosen in the game, sliding over. Now black takes on e5, d takes e5, then rook takes e5, then bishop b8, retreating the bishop and pressuring the rook on the e5 square. Now we have rook takes e6, queen takes e6, and then queen to h4, sliding over with the queen, trying to keep it on the board, but black simply goes queen to e7, once again offering that queen trade. And here, Hans Niemann, he does go for the queen trade. Queen takes e7, then rook takes e7, and this is a very good time to slow down and take inventory. What the heck is going on in this position? Well, overall, black here has a very small but very stable long-term advantage. Number one, he has the better pawn structure. Black, of course, has 1-2 pawn islands versus the 1-2-3 pawn islands of white. The d5 square in particular is very, very weak, and that knight is just plonked there in front of the weak isolated pawn on d4. Beyond that, black also has an extra bishop versus the extra knight of white, and with pawns on both sides of the board, that bishop on b8 will be a little bit stronger than the extra knight, especially with those pawns on light squares in the black camp, making that a good bishop on b8 instead of a bad bishop. So overall, these factors do give Magnus a very small but very stable advantage, and defending here as white is going to be very, very difficult for the future world champion Hans Niemann. All right, knight f1 chosen in the game, retreating the knight. Then we have king g7, g3, rook to e2, the rook flying down to the second rank. Then knight 1 d2, blocking the rook and defending the pawn on b2 preemptively. Then bishop a7, pressuring that pawn on d4. Then we have king f1, pressures the rook, rook to e7, A3, guarding B4, then knight C7. Where is the knight going? Potentially B5, as now with that pawn on A3, B5 would be an excellent square where it can pressure that pawn on D4. And of course, the knight can always go back to D5 later if it needs to. So Magnus staying very, very flexible so far in this endgame. All right, Hans continues. Knight C4, jumping up with the knight. Then we have rook D7, then knight to E3, dropping back with the knight. But it turns out in this position, knight A5 was the stronger move, pressuring, if I can draw arrows, that pawn on B7. Instead, knight to E3 chosen in the game, then knight E6 for black. Now here, knight C2, and finally black goes F5, gaining space in the center of the board. This is how you know Magnus Carlsen is turning up the heat. He is certainly playing for a win in this endgame. All right, king to E2 is the move, then king F6, then king to D3, centralizing the king, then C5, gaining space on the queen side. Now we have the move king to C3, and this turns out to be a very significant mistake. Instead, king to E2 was necessary. Maintain the defense of the pawn on F2 with the king. That way you're blunting the bishop on this diagonal at least a little bit. But instead, with king C3 on the board, this bishop will be very, very strong, targeting the weak pawn on F2 via the X-ray attack. Now we have C takes D4, knight F takes D4, and knight G5. The knight eyeing those E4 and G3 and F3 and H3 squares on the king side. Now rook F1 defends that pawn on F2 preemptively, but knight E4 hits the king. King D3, knight C5, king E2, and then knight A4, pressuring that pawn on B2. Magnus Carlsen is just relentless in this endgame, and he is slowly but surely starting to pull away with this game. All right, knight F3 chosen in the game. Then rook E7 is the king. King D2, knight takes B2, knight B4, rook D7, king C3, knight A4 hits the king, king C2, and then knight C5. Now we have knight to D2, dropping back with the knight, knight E6, knight B3, G5, F3, bishop B8, targeting the pawn on G3. Magnus again slowly taking over here. All right, G4 tries to defend that pawn. Knight F4 jumps into the newly weakened F4 square. Then rook E1 slides over the rook. Bishop B5, king B1, rook C7, rook D1, rook C3, flying in with the rook, pressuring both B3 and F3. Now king to A2 defends the knight, but gives up the pawn on F3. Rook takes F3 chosen in the game, and here Magnus is officially up a single pawn in the endgame. All right, knight C5 jumps up with the knight, pressures that pawn on B7. Now rook takes H3, knight D7 hits the king and hits the bishop on D6, or E6, sorry, on E5. Now king E6 hits the knight and defends the bishop. We have knight C5 hits the king, king F7, G takes F5, and then king to F6. Hans Niemann winning a pawn temporarily, but of course, that pawn on F6 is as good as gone. Now rook D7 flying up with the rook, king takes F5, rook takes B7, then A5, driving back that knight on B3, knight C6 jumps up with the knight, then we have rook H2, king B1, bishop F6, rook B5, and king to G4, getting out of the way of the future discovered attack. Potentially ideas like knight D7 were coming up next. Of course, that does give up the pawn on A4 sooner or later, but before taking it, white goes knight to E4, jumping in with the knight once again, pressuring that weak bishop on F6. Now bishop G7, rook takes A5, rook B2 hits the king, king C1, knight E2, king D1, knight C3, then we have knight takes, bishop takes, and then rook C5, getting out of the way of the attack of the bishop and pressuring the bishop on its own. Now bishop F6, A4, rook A2, A5, H5, knight B4, pressures that rook on A2, rook to A4, pressures the knight. Then we have rook C4, hits the king, king F3, rook C6, pressures the bishop on F6, then rook takes B4, rook takes F6, and then king G3. And now officially, we do have a rook endgame where white has one pawn on the queen side versus those two pawns on the king side. Black here is clearly favored to win. His king is also a lot more active than the white counterpart, but of course, Hans Niemann will have some chances in this game. All right, A6 chosen, then rook A4, king C2, H4, now king B3, rook A1, king B2, rook a5, king b3, and finally h3, advancing the h-pawn and threatening simply h2, then h1. That would be enough to effectively win the game on the spot. Now, king b4 hits the rook, rook a1, king b5, and here in this position, Magnus Carlsen makes the final move of the game. He just goes h2, and here Hans Niemann is forced to resign. There is simply nothing he can do to stop the advance of the pawn to the h1 square. That is going to win the game on the spot, and for that reason here, Hans Niemann, he is forced to resign to the former world champion, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and the future world champion, Hans Niemann, in the 2024 World Blitz Championships. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. Comment down below in terms of what you thought of this game, if you liked it, if you didn't like it, and so on. Very curious what you thought of this game between the new rivals Hans Niemann and Magnus Carlsen. I mean, I think we're going to see a lot more of Hans and Magnus, with Hans literally being like a top 3 chess.com blitz player right now. I mean, who would have thought? That guy has skyrocketed in the rankings. So also comment in terms of what you think about that. And if you want to see more Magnus versus Hans action, check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen disrespects Hans Niemann with a rook sacrifice right out of the opening in freestyle chess. That game was insane. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.